Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Thursday, May 9th. We'll be doing an update about AMC. We'll touch on GME because it's an interesting action in the day for GME and a little bit on IWM perhaps. I'll try to do a little bit of an overview on some of the other tickers I've been looking at, but I'm going to focus mostly on AMC just to start. So earnings, overall, my impression of earnings was it was mostly positive. I know that in the past, I've been very critical, openly critical about Adam Aron as a CEO coming out and scolding retail and just kind of taking every good piece of news and adding on to it sort of a negative back into it. He would be like, oh, we're doing this and this and this, and this was very good, but then we're not in other woods yet, or we're not, doing this, or this is still a problem, or that's, you know what I mean? He's been very slow to build any kind of real optimism in the last 4 to 6 months, I would say. He's been very negative on the whole. I did not hear that during earnings. What I heard sounded like a pretty confident CEO that times are changing, things are getting better, and that the steps that they've taken have produced a good yield and will continue to produce a good yield in a positive direction. That all being said, added into a technical outlook for AMC. My chart's a little messy right now, but I don't expect people to go back and rewatch any of the old streams. But for the most part, this week has been fairly spot on. Going into like Monday, Tuesday, my prediction was that we'd probably sit pretty much right around 315 because that's where the 30 minute 180 moving average was. And every single earnings report, we've kind of had that same camping that's happened going into and out of earnings. And so that was my expectation. It also is like a liquid center. It's a little confusing, my chart, but I wanted to point out that this is like the upper echelon of the upper echelon, which is a really good thing. So if you look at this as like a 50-50 right here, this being that first move, we spent almost all of our time in that upper 50%. Now that doesn't mean it's an accumulation. In and of itself, that could mean nothing because this could just be a distributive top that then drives you back down to the lower area where you might need to go get a spring or distribute if that's the case, if sellers are still in control. When you look at the upper range though, it's also spent a lot of time, if not most of its time, in that 50% upper region. Now I'm starting to feel a little more positive because you're seeing how it's being bought back up. We're not spending a whole lot of time in the low areas. So suddenly it's like the range within the range is starting to look pretty good. And then this is just kind of a recap. And then looking at the smallest possible range, same deal. You've kind of got this 50-50 spread between the lower end here going down to about 304 and then the upper end going up to about 340. And we've been spending most of our time in the higher region. But here's the big but, right? The issue with this is, yes, it looks like a giant cat ear. Did it become distributive? If you look at this in extended hours, right here, this is back on Friday, April 26th, there's what looks like a massive upthrust. It does then make it look distributive. If you do not include extended trading hours, I could not conclude that this is absolutely distributive based only on the price movement. Do I think that this local area right here on May 6th is a distributive type top? Yes. But my conclusion for that was, okay, that probably just means that we're going to need to go below 304, and that's what happened after earnings. So beyond that, you're kind of wondering, 304 and lower, are you going to have a change of character? That's where it needed to happen today. I don't know for a fact that it did happen. We're going to find out tomorrow if there's some follow-through action with this. But it did jump the creeks that were established because of earnings. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 up and down movements going from roughly $3.30 down to $3. And then you have what seems to be a substantial buy-in period where you've crossed this kind of creek that was established. Now, did that jump a creek on the big picture? No. I think that outermost trend is going to be the big question mark here. You could see this kind of coast into Friday, consolidate around 3, and frankly not see any kind of definite move until Monday. So you need to be aware that that's a possibility. My thoughts right now are yes, we're trading below that 30-minute average. It doesn't look awesome as a result of that. We did drop here on this cat ear, which is typically like that four top business. And then at the end of the day, you need to jump this red creek. Typically what we see, and I did a diagram earlier today on stream, and it's a very simple diagram. This is typically what we see in the cat ears, is that we have the double ear, which is sort of like the first and the second. You might call this a UT and UTAD if that's the way they present themselves. And this would just be like an LPSY. I usually call it ear one, ear two, and then a hook. This is distributive as a top if that hook occurs, and then there's continuation down. As you can see, we got that hook this morning. That's this marker right here. It definitely crossed almost entirely in pre-market, after hours action. And then this morning we pushed back up to 317, which of course is near that 30-minute. It's near that liquid center up here. We actually rejected first thing and head down. So my first thought of the day was it looks like it just hooked, because it did. I mean, this is the trend that we had. It was what we were kind of butting up against going into earnings, and we dumped beneath it. Okay. However, that being said, there's a couple things that are worth pointing out here. So number one is that typically when we get these cat ear kind of business going, I'm always looking at two things. There's two trends I look at. The first is the uptrend. That's the one that we just hooked on. And the reason I look at that is because in the event of a spring, which happens, where like maybe the top is distributive, but then you come down for a spring action. A great example of this is the March 2022 move. And in that move, what happened is as soon as we hit that spring, we came back up and retested the floor. And then we had an ascending accumulation up to this cat ear creek, as we might call it. And then we race up to the top and we jump over this guy. Okay. Now, if you're following, this makes perfect sense because this is your spring action, right? This is a retest and a buy-in. And then when you get back to the top of the range, this is your SOS, right? And so all of these things tend to work together in order to produce a spring action and then a run. What about in the event of an LPS? Well, we haven't had a whole lot of those. There's been a few examples, but in the example of like an LPS, my expectation would be that you probably would get this breakdown, but then essentially you would just turn back around early. And has this happened before? Yes. One example is the big one, which is the May to June run. It almost looks exactly like this. Go back and look at it, and you can see, was there a localized spring action? Maybe you could argue there was, but on the big picture, you know, it basically looks like this. On the big picture, this actually goes lower, so that maybe you could argue was like a spring-like action, but then the second one doesn't ever, you know, make a new low, and it ends up being a lot more like an LPS action and a reaccumulation, and then you jump the creek, so on and so forth. So if you're asking, is it possible that you get a spring or you get an LSPY, if you get a last point of support instead of a spring, yes, there is, there's cause for that. And when you look at the larger range, so if I look at just this smaller range, I read this particular motion as distribution. But all that really tells me is that we're probably going beneath 304, and that's what happened. Once that happens, you have to deal with the larger problem of, okay, now we've created a hook. But you have to also remember this upper 50% is also its own little range. And in my opinion, without extended trading hours on, I don't see this as particularly bearish. I don't see anything that's kind of breaking up too far. To me, it looks like this could very well be a healthy range. Well, where would you go for that? That's why I have this 284 marked out. I think that would be the level that you might head to in the event that you need a spring and we're going to maintain this upper 50%, not go to the lower. Okay, that's one of those situations that I really can't control. And if it happens, it could happen on a Monday. We could see this drop down and we could go into a spring-like action. And frankly, we could be going by midweek back up top. All right, but the other situation is the one in which basically this fails and you see a weakness and then we're going down low. I have on my chart one one thought at 276 for a potential spring bottom, but that's only if the spring is around the 280 for upper 50%. Otherwise, it needs to go all the way down to 239 and then go below that. That's frankly almost exactly what we saw happen March 4th going into March 22nd of 2022. And you can go check. If you don't believe me, go check it out. It looks pretty much identical to this, where it dropped down, it created a little bit of a final hook, and then it goes down, it makes a new low, and then it works itself out over, 10 days or so. And that would be about a week that we could spend down low. That might happen if there's a need for liquidity. If this was not satisfied and we're going to come back down later, that could happen. And you have to remember the end result of that of that March move was actually not great for us because it ultimately resulted in, a huge wash back down. So that being said, does that mean that we have to do that or whatever? No. And I'm just saying, as these ranges work themselves out, I think that the first range is kind of, basically in my mind, is kind of finished. I see this as a positive. The fact that we pushed back up, we made a higher low here on quite a bit of selling. There's a lot of selling positions that were opened or people selling off or whatever and trading out their positions. I don't know. You can kind of venture a guess. But then look at the buy-ins that happen as we jump that local downtrend. My big thing is, hey, it's got to be over this red guy. Once it gets over that red guy, I'm all for it. I think it's probably going to have a decently strong move. So if I'm looking at tomorrow, that might be 310 and then moving up to 320. 310 to 320 would be a really strong move. And I think if we can hold at 320 going into Monday, you could see some fireworks should we pursue. No matter what, this and this have to be met. These two conditions have to be met. This red and yellow have to be met if you're going to have a run here. Pretty straightforward. The other condition, of course, is the major creek, and that could cause some issues. You can see that there's plenty of time. I mean, if an operator wanted to run this thing from where we are and not go lower for a spring, there's still a lot of time here to chop. I mean, you could take a couple weeks, frankly, at least another week plus to get this set up, and then another week to kind of get back to the top. And this may not be moving until late May because there's a lot of time here to kind of get to that creek, jump it, go up to the top of the range and this yellow line mark, and then jump that, much like, again, what we saw in that March example. That's kind of the bullish outlook here. The only real bearish outlook I have, again, based on what I think was a pretty positive earnings, the only real bearish outlook I have is just continuing to go for those lower creeks. I'm not seeing that trend that we usually see, which is that these create steeper and steeper downward motions. They're almost all parallel. If you go to look at these 50% crosses on these downtrend, let's call them sine waves because that's what they are, they're almost all parallel at this point. They're not pointing to some ridiculously low target. And that tends to be a fairly positive sign for us because that just means that there doesn't seem to be a drive. There's not an increase in selling that's causing them to drive the price down. And that's usually what we see with those creeks when they form. However, there is a really, really high one that you can go back to from here. That's from, let me see, March 28th, and then the midpoint being around April 19th. That drives you down to the bottom of the channel that we're kind of in, and that would take you as low as, I think, 160 something. That's the same price target that Stockfather got, and I think it's a reasonable target if there's continuation beyond this range. But right now, I'm actually feeling pretty bullish about it. I think the market at the whole looking jumpy. I just think that you have to make sure you're aware of confirmation. These are my notes from the earnings. I'm not going to go through them all. Just kind of going through them on stream, but mostly positive because of F&B. And yeah, so I think overall it's looking pretty good. When I look at IWM, this was kind of expected that you would hit here and perhaps form a double top. You can see the creek crosses below. There's a double M shape here, and then you're probably going to have another one. That's usually how the stock climbs if it's jumping kind of a creek-like motion. I think that's what we're seeing. No, it's not super pronounced on the moving average on the 4 hour, but you can see the shapes in the price action and the RSI pretty clearly. So my expectation is that this is basically like a double M cross of this jump, and I don't think much else of it right now. I think there's a possibility that we see a continuation pretty high. You know, there's a support kind of right where we're at 205, and then another one up here around 208. Either of those might act as a temporary resistance for us until we come back and find support. I'm of the opinion that this probably takes a little while. So even if we got a burst move, I don't know if we're going to just jump right over the main creek just yet, which is way up here. And that's all-time trend to the top that we recently had on the 28th. The cross section on this sine wave makes me think we don't get back up to that jump until probably around May 30th. So that's quite a bit of time. That's about a month to stew. And this is an S-curve, but an S-curve that could have some pullbacks. So there's no reason to expect that this couldn't come back down low at this point. I do think that based on the fact that it held this particular trend, it could be a little stronger than expected. We may not have a deep pullback to 200, which is what I was originally expecting. It just depends. We're going to have to kind of wait and eyeball it, because I don't know if this breaks down, maybe, but if not, we might just camp high. We might just camp above 204, and I think that's a possibility. It really just depends on the sellers and needs for any kind of liquidity. 199 was kind of one of the key spots. That's why I thought we would come back, because we just kind of jumped over it and left. But maybe that's part of a short trap. You know, like, it's hard to say. Either way, I'm not particularly like worried. There's two trends. One is fairly wide down here. That's this yellow one that I have drawn. That could be like a trend that could take us, again, back down pretty far before we go back up. You can see how that might result in a longer term sort of wind out, where you're sort of doing a widening, for example, until you're ready to sort of break and head back up to all-time highs. But, you know, there's also a steeper trend here, and we really don't know which will be adopted just yet. This one does suggest that unless you dump immediately, you're probably not going to go super low. And that's the one I'm thinking, like, if there's strength, we may just kind of stay to that one, you know. Still, I'm expecting this to take some time. I don't expect it to just go straight up. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. The reason I'm using this is I'm being really conservative about that upward angle. There is a less conservative view, which is using this final hook point, and that would suggest that you actually get up to 215 really soon, like next week. That's a less conservative viewpoint. You can see why I think both, you could argue for both, you know, based on the angles that we do have. Both of those seem kind of reasonable to me, and those are fairly far apart in terms of when they get to the top again. But look, I'm all for it, regardless if it's a breakout. And speaking of which, GME had a push back to its high in this fallout. This is a very large M shape that I talked about quite a bit, because there was a big divergence happening in RSI. Visually, you can see it. The bottoms from August, way back over here, August 25th, to the bottoms we're at now. We've had it steadily increasing RSI build out. And that being said, we're jumping over one of the all-time downtrends. And I say all-time, that's not really correct. Since the squeeze, right? This is the trend right here, and I'm going to make it a slightly different color so you can see it. That's the trend right there that I'm looking at, and we pressed up against it, and I said I didn't think it was a good idea to break out too early before going back and testing 15. We didn't quite get there, and, you know, sometimes that happens. If you're in a moment where bulls have control, you may not get that low. We came down to like 1540, which is kind of a liquid center. It's where the top of the gap was. Right now you can see on the daily, it jumped the daily moving average. That's happened before, and it hasn't resulted in a big run. But the difference is that we're jumping a pretty major downtrend, okay? What about this other one that you've got on the screen, Booksy? Well, there's two other peaks, and it sort of just depends on methodology and like what you think about how, let's just say, a run might build out, I actually think that all of these will be checked at some point. So you could keep doing this, like you could keep going lower and lower and lower pretty much indefinitely until, you know, you get down to the widest possible angle. You know, do I think that all of these will be checked on the way out? Yes. So there's still a little bit of resistance that might be met. If it ends up that that's where, you know, we find resistance, that's where we find resistance. So I'm saying about $20, we might hit some serious resistance. And also, this is a previous top, so you don't really want a double top here. And with all that being said, does that give us room to come back down? Yeah, it does. I think on the local time frame, there's still a lot of space to come back down to like 15. My concern was jumping too early could result in some really negative price action. I'm not so concerned about that seeing the move that we saw today, because it did check it and then it just kind of ripped through it. We will see, okay? I do not think it's impossible that this comes back down and retests like 1560 or something, and we will have to wait and see what happens there. But if it's on a tear, it's on a tear. You can see the volumes pouring in. We got a pretty light pullback, all things considered, with volume kind of shrinking at the end of that pullback. I'm talking about this guy right here. Pretty light volume pullback, and we're getting another buy-in. Volume has to continue. That's the big thing, right? Because on smaller time frames, is this divergent? Yes. You know what I mean? On smaller time frames, this made a higher high with a lower RSI. It hasn't made a top, so you want to make sure that volume pulls through for you. Because right now it looks like lesser volume than the first bar that led you to the first buying climax. Does that make sense? So there has to be follow through, and otherwise you could see that pullback kind of work itself out, perhaps into the next earnings. But do I think overall this looks pretty positive? Yeah, and notice how this already jumped over its cat ear motion. It's back above that creek, which is also now above the moving average. Has that happened before on GME? No. No, it really hasn't. And that's kind of like the stuff that you want to see. Is you want to see a change. You want to see something distinction that tells you, yes, this is not the way that normally this has gone. In the past, you know, when we've created these, you could call them LSPYs, they're stair steps. We usually don't reach it, or we get close and we kind of just sell back down through it. Now that has happened. You can see right here, like for example, if you use this lower one, yeah, like I would say that yes, it's possible that this was a breach through it and then it broke back down. But for the most part, looking back, I'm looking at all of these as they were set up, and I'm not seeing that we've ever come back. Those have been generally hooks, right? That's typically what we see after it dives down, and especially if it dives and makes a new low, you typically see that hooking action. And this has happened repeatedly on GME over the last couple of years. Like I said, there's really not a lot of evidence. Like here you've got 3 times that it kind of came back up and sort of rapped on the door, and it never broke it, you know? So for me, this is a big deal in so much as like, when I look at those cat ear structures, that typically doesn't happen unless you've made like a spring or something like that. Now, we always have to be aware that head fakes are possible. I don't want to be a negative Nancy, but there's always that possibility. So where do you want to find support? Really, at this point, you really just want to find support above like 15. I think that anything above 15 here could provide a pretty strong support for us. And yes, if we were to continue to break upward, let's say to $24 or maybe $23.45 right here, yeah, you just want to, when you have those pullbacks, you want to keep continuation going. And do I think it's possible it builds out into something like this? It could, but you have to remember like stages, right? Like early stages of this breakout were rife with all kinds of massive pullbacks. Now these were big moves, but nonetheless, it took time, you know, to kind of walk it up. And we might see something like that before any kind of major move. If this is indeed a wedging action, and I think it's a little bit tricky because I think a lot of people might look at this and say it's not really a wedge, it's more of a flag. I think it's a wedge. I think this is a narrowing price action. if you use the trend that we were talking about earlier, I don't see it as I can't help but see it as a narrowing action because each of these steps looks smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think it's a narrowing action. The Bukowski target for that is like $80. And I went back and I checked, and it's like right there. It's like at 85, which is like the previous spot that this hit resistance. It makes a lot of sense. So that usually kind of adds some credibility maybe. Timing, I can't tell you that for sure. And I haven't really examined it that much. Going forward, I'm just going to check a couple other boxes here. Charge point, I've been talking about how if we can have a low volume sell-off back down here to about $1.64, this has also jumped its creek. This is not a small thing. This is the one that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, this kind of downward M shape. This is typically what you see in the shallow S curve, and then there's a breakout from that, and you end up rocketing back to like the top of the structure. That's a move all the way up to like 350. Now, timing I'm suspect of because I actually built this out and thought it was going to take a lot longer. So I'm not sure yet exactly where we would expect certain things to happen, but absolutely it could be near future. Okay. One of the other ones that I've been kind of watching recently and I've been talking about quite a bit is MPW. So I'm going to very briefly talk about that, and then we'll finish again with expectations for Friday on AMC. So MPW is this massive widening. I think it's in a place where right now we could experience a break to the upside on this like inverted head and shoulder structure back up to like $7. And then potentially from there, if we can find support, may take as long as the next earnings. But if we can find support, I think it'll break out. This price target is frankly just like the top. It's at $24. It seems a little crazy, but this is wildly undervalued, this stock, in terms of its fundamental value. It also pays a dividend. So if you just want to hold a good stock that pays a dividend, it pays a dividend. It is an REIT, so you have to do your own research on it. Don't just take my word for it. That's not smart. Do your own DD. I'm not trying to give you financial advice here. I'm saying that this is, in my opinion, one that I'm watching because it looks like a good trade. And going back to AMC, one more time, we really just want to see that breakout here. It's pretty straightforward. You don't want to see that continuation with the hook. This is sort of what the hook looked like last time. We got a hook and then it broke down and there was a few more up thrusts. Pretty light volume until the very end, and then it had a fake breakout and drop. And that could happen to us. We could have a kind of fake out move to like 317 or 320, and then it just dump afterwards. So you have to be really careful and aware of like confirmation does not mean just breaking a line. Confirmation is support. And so in this case, support really would have to be found in the 330 area, in my opinion. And I think at that point you've jumped just like with charge point. At that point, you may have jumped this actual major trend, which is that big shallow S curve. It's the end of a big sequence. There's so many good markings here for the possibility of a reversal. I'm just of the opinion that it could happen after a spring. And I know that that's not what everybody sees. Some people just see downside. I get it. I do. I know those targets exist. I'm feeling optimistic based on the way this built out, based on the volume and everything else we've looked at. So I'll be excited to see what happens the rest of the week. And then going into Monday, I'll update if there's major updates. But otherwise, I hope you guys have a good one. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you later.